Beck and welcome to a video about nonfiction, which is kind of unusual for my channel. Mostly I read science fiction and fantasy, but I've been branching a little bit into nonfiction, which is why I wanted to do this tag and actually talk about it, because I feel like it's not discussed as readily on BookTube as a lot of other titles. So without further ado, I've got several questions to get through, so let's begin. Question number one is, how much nonfiction do you read? And I was looking at my Goodreads reading challenges from the past, and there were 2 years in 2021 and 2022 where I read no nonfiction titles whatsoever. And then this year I've already read 4 different titles. My nonfiction is picking up, and I think it's because my interest is broadening in terms of what I'm reading. Usually, like I said, sci-fi and fantasy is my go-to, and I read a bit of romance as well. But then to kind of cleanse my palate in between each read, or if I feel like I'm falling into a reading slump, I found that dipping into a nonfiction is a really nice way to broaden my horizons in terms of reading and adjust my reading mood as well. Then we've got question 2, which says, what kind of nonfiction videos do you want to make for your channel? And honestly, just videos like this where I talk about the different nonfiction titles that I've been reading and I would recommend, which are obviously coming up, but then also to potentially do a yearly wrap up of nonfiction and say, like, this is what worked for me, this is what didn't, this is the subcategory that I'm currently interested in, and that kind of thing. Because over life, like the course of your life and experiences, I feel like the interests in different aspects of nonfiction tend to shift. Like, I studied obviously writing and literature at school, but I also loved science. And so I've got an interest in biology, but sometimes it also depends on what the title is and who is writing it, of whether I'm interested or not. And you know, that applies for my fiction books as well. So I should have probably connected those dots, but if it's a really dry medical text, for example, I'm not going to be interested. But if it's a person-focused experience and it's discussing topics that are scientific, I'm way more interested. So if I've got that focus angle of a almost human point of view, I'm much more keen, which very much leads us into question 3, which is, what is your favorite sub-genre of nonfiction? And like I said, that personal aspect is what I'm most interested in, which is probably why my interest in nonfiction at the moment has been mostly in terms of mental health and trauma. And I'm also keen on gender studies as well, because that's what I wrote my thesis on when I was studying in university. I also wanted to look into gender itself and how psychologically we perceive it as a society, and then also as we perceive medical health and mental health in tandem with that, because it seems like we are way behind. And I've been reading a book called The Body Keeps the Score. This has discussed mental health and trauma in a way that is across time. So it's following this one doctor, again, that one point of view, and he's listing not only different case studies, but what he himself has learned over this time. And this time means like decades of time. So I like that it's a overarching study, but from a personal angle where you can get his specific experiences, because that makes it easier for me to follow. And I find it fascinating how the body holds trauma and how we blank out parts of our brain in a similar way to someone who's had a stroke. Someone who has experienced PTSD and trauma would have the same physiological reaction in their brain to that stroke victim. So it's just an honestly fascinating subject to me. And even just, you know, in everyday life, when you go to the doctor, you have a series of symptoms and they might completely misprescribe medication to you. So at a base level with our physical body, we are still not being perceived correctly. So can you imagine just the scope of mental health and what we are only just discovering now and what is still going undiscovered? So it's definitely a point that I'm very fascinated in, and it's a topic that I'm definitely going to read more about as well. Then question 4 is, do you have a favorite nonfiction book? And it might come as a surprise that I don't give star ratings to my nonfiction titles. I give star ratings to my fiction books all the time, but I feel like they're much more subjective to read a fiction book than to read a nonfiction. So I like to, I don't know how pretentious this is going to sound, because I like to experience my nonfiction. So I don't give it a star rating. But I think in terms of what I mean by experiencing my nonfiction is that I let it percolate over time. So after I have finished reading it, or even after I finished a chapter, I might give it a bit of a break, or obviously read other things in between. So I like to refocus on the subject matter at different points in time after each of those chapters chapters or after I finished each nonfiction title and recognize it in tandem with my own experiences. For example, if I'm reading about obviously psychology and trauma, how am I experiencing my everyday life and what are my reactions like compared to my family and my friends and people that I don't even know, reacting in public. I like to look at it with a different focus and a different lens. And I think what comes from a great nonfiction book is these little lessons, or at least have our perspective minutely shifted or more informed. And I like to leave a nonfiction title recognizing those little moments in my life or, in everyday life and going, oh, okay, that's from when I was reading this book about trauma and someone might be reacting in anger, but they're actually feeling a much deeper emotion or it's a trigger for them or something like that. So in that way, I like to apply the subject matter of my nonfiction titles to everyday lived experience. Doesn't necessarily work in every nonfiction title because I do like reading memoirs every now and then, and applying the life of, say, Tom Felton to my life is completely and utterly separate. But that is why I read memoir and nonfiction for different reasons depending on my mood. Question 5 is, what do you think keeps people from reading nonfiction? And honestly, it just kind of seems boring in general because I went through a couple of years, like I said, without touching nonfiction at all. And that's because I was like, my brain falls asleep when I read nonfiction. That might be true of certain nonfiction titles, but I found that it's not true of the subgenre and categories in general, because I believe that there is a nonfiction book out there for everyone, the same way I believe that there's a fiction book out there for everyone. We've just got to find our little niche of what we love reading about and in the style and tone that we can take on and enjoy. For example, I tried to read the very popular The Subtle Art of Not Giving Up, and I absolutely hated it because it sounded so utterly condescending to me that I could not finish it. But it's obviously popular because, the title is evocative, and also some people would relate to it and experience things in tandem with what it's talking about. So even though I hated it, I know that other people will enjoy it. So I feel like there is a nonfiction title again for all different kinds of people, but it's about finding the little things that you are interested in terms of topic and narration style. I found also that an audiobook over a physical book is generally the way I prefer to read nonfiction, because if I'm sitting down and reading a nonfiction title, it's very much feeling like I am studying for an exam. And while I didn't hate school, I also just don't like feeling like I'm studying. Again, it turns my brain off rather than activating it. So if I can listen to an audiobook version through my library, for example, I very much connect to it way more than I would reading it physically. And I think that's because the audio performance of a book naturally lifts it, and it's like someone is reading a story to me, which makes me more willing to engage with it too. Also, potentially the reason that people don't read nonfiction is because some of it can be quite confronting. I read a book called I Hate You Don't Leave Me, and that was about borderline personality disorder and how as a mental health disorder it can be misdiagnosed if you're just looking at it through anxiety or depression. The treatments for anxiety or depression don't work with people who have borderline personality disorder, so it's important to take a lot of things into consideration. But because this book had different case studies in it about different patients and what did not and did work in treatment for them, it was quite a heavy book, and I found that I couldn't read it cover to cover. But that's what I mean about dipping in and out of nonfiction. I think it's a very strategic thing to do, to read a chapter or two here and there. And I'd listen to maybe half an hour a day, or maybe even less than that to get through a title like this. So nonfiction probably also takes longer to read because of the subject matter, but it's definitely got the value there if you spend the time to do that. And then question 6 is, why do I, or why do you like nonfiction? And I like it for a lot of different reasons, but one reason that I feel like people don't really talk about is that because it can potentially become a bit voyeuristic, like a part of everybody is naturally nosy. We're all curious, and nonfiction gives us that little window of insight into a memoir, so someone's life, or into a topic that you might not feel comfortable discussing. So curiosity would definitely be a huge one for me when it comes to reading nonfiction. Also learning just in general. I do like learning about different topics. And then also feeling seen through storytelling. Question 7 is, what is a nonfiction book that you read because of BookTube? Probably Atomic Habits, because, this is sold over 1 million copies, so people have naturally talked about it. And I wouldn't necessarily say it's a brilliant book. I wouldn't say it's a bad book. It's just kind of there, and if you want to read it, go ahead. It had decent points in it that you can take away and apply to your everyday life, which is, my basic standard of what I want from a nonfiction book. But in terms of raving about it being a favorite book. It's just a nonfiction I read and I would recommend it if you're interested, but other than that, I wouldn't push it on anyone. I don't know why it got so popular, maybe because it's just simple. Then question 8 is, what is a nonfiction book you have read lately? And like I said earlier, The Body Keeps the Score is one that I have been reading for a little while, and I've been reading it for a while because it's discussing trauma, so it's not an easy read by any means, and I feel like I've talked about it a little bit too much. I mention it in my what I'm currently reading videos as well that I do weekly, so I will link those below for a bit more detail and synopses. But I also have a book on my holds list at my library, and that is called How to Keep House While Drowning, and it's a very short audiobook, about 3 hours long, and I imagine it just chronicles everyday life and how it can get overwhelming. And I've heard it said so many times that as an adult, if you're sitting down and relaxing, it means you're probably actively ignoring things that you have to do, and so it's probably about how to make peace with that at some extent as well. So I'm interested, but I don't know again if I'm going to like the narration style. I'm just going to see how it goes. Then question 9 is, what are some of your nonfiction reading goals? And after looking at the very poor stats over the past couple of years of how many nonfiction titles I've read, which is not many at all, I would very much like to read more than 5 in a year, because adding them into my reading palette makes me feel a little bit more intelligent. I'm just going to say it. And then also it broadens my horizons on topics that I previously had no knowledge of. For example, there is a book on my library to be read pile that I've only recently added after filming my library TBR video, because of course that would happen, but it's about a woman in her early 20s who worked at a crematorium, which sounds very taboo, which is part of the reason that I want to try it. It also branches out past my mental health, psychology, and memoir focus, so it means that I can kind of test the waters somewhere that I haven't been brave enough or aware enough of to try yet. And then finally, question 10 is, what is your advice for incorporating more nonfiction books into your reading diet? And I think recognizing what reading mood you're in would go a long way, because I tend to get stuck in between different books that I'm reading. I might not know what to pick up next. When I read a nonfiction, I feel refreshed to go into the next fantasy or science fiction that I've got waiting for me, because like I said, it's an entirely different brain space, at least to me, to go into a fantasy book where everything is made up and you're learning everything from the ground up. Whereas if I'm going into a book about psychology, I know a little bit about psychology. I know how people interact, and it's all set in our everyday world, which I already know about, theoretically. So going into a nonfiction title is a bit easier in terms of understanding the palette and the scope of it. But then also my advice on reading more nonfiction in general would be try audiobooks, because getting through a nonfiction, like I said, can feel a bit dry. And it's honestly helped me so much to go to my local library and get audiobooks that way, because if I'm doing a mindless task like doing the vacuuming or doing the dishes, I can maybe listen to a chapter of a nonfiction book. And if you can be consistent about a habit like that, then I think you're well on your way to reading more. Basically, if you can have small, consistent commitments to reading nonfiction or reading in general, then I think you're well on your way to reading more nonfiction in your reading appetite. But that is the nonfiction book tag. Thank you so much for watching to this point if you're here. But if you have any recommendations for more nonfiction titles that you think I should try, let me know, because I'm always keen to broaden my scope and broaden my horizons. But thank you again so much for watching this video. I'll come chat to you in the comments down below, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.